We are here today to listen to the wonderful Robbie Bedbrook about self-care and preventing burnout. Lots of people here probably already know Robbie very well. His bio is in the little book if you would like to read more. But Robbie is a registered nurse with a passion for health promotion, social justice and primary health care. He works predominantly in primary health care with a focus on sexual health, mental health and managing chronic illness. And I would like to invite Robbie up to speak.
Will this work? Oh, hold on. Yes. Okay, it worked. Amazing. Hello. Thank you very much for coming to this session, which I think is very, very important. So it's lovely to see so many warm, friendly faces here as well. I want to start this. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good, because I'm quite loud anyway, and I think there's double mic action going on, so hopefully it shouldn't be an issue. I would like to start this presentation the way that I start every presentation. The first is to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, which are the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and especially extend that to any Indigenous colleagues who might be here today as well. And the second way that I start every presentation is to tell you that I do not pretend to be an expert on this subject. I am not an expert on any subject, except maybe like pop stars of the 90s and 2000s. So like you want to chat Kelly Clarkson discography, I will take you on that. But otherwise, I am just someone who, specifically about this area, self-care, burnout, emotional intelligence, I'm just very, very passionate about it, and I've spent a lot of time trying to learn as much as I can to improve and build my scope around it, and I am very passionate about health communication as well. But I recognise that there is a huge wealth of expertise in this room, people who have maybe done research or studied this or experienced it or seen people who have experienced workplace stress and burnout as well, and hopefully we will tap into that expertise. Very informal, chilled out vibe. If you have a question that you don't want to wait till the end to ask, please put your hand up. You can ask it at any point. I love a chat. I know a lot of us do as well. So if we're going off on a tangent, I'll like wrap it up and we'll push them to the end. But otherwise, if you feel like you must interject, especially if I put up a stat that's wrong or something, please do and correct it. As Helen mentioned, my name's Robbie. I'm a registered nurse. I am based in Sydney. My background is primary health care and predominantly sexual health and HIV. And I'm also an honorary associate lecturer at the University of Wollongong. Woo, go UAW. Okay. So, what are we going to talk about today? Oh, I've also been told if you see me quickly correct myself, it's because apparently this is being filmed, and I'm like quite a big mover, as you will discover, but I've been given like a very small radius to work with. So if you see me drifting, just like gesture this way. So what are we going to talk about today? 3 very, very simple things. We're going to talk about what burnout is, we're going to talk about why it happens to nurses, and then we're going to talk about what we can do about it as well. Hopefully very, very simple. I dread even using this word, lock the doors, but there'll be some interaction. Interactive is like a dirty word in a workshop and it's terrifying, but we will have to talk to each other at some point. To kick things off, before I kind of launch into what burnout is and workplace stress and where it comes from and what contributes to it, the first thing that I actually want to talk about is vulnerability. And there's so many animal photos during this presentation. I hope everyone's on board for this. And I want to talk about vulnerability because vulnerability is the essence of connection. And my main goal, my overarching goal with this workshop is actually just to make everyone in this room feel much more connected than when we first came in, so that we can take that into the rest of the conference, form a better network, bigger connections, and kind of take that energy moving forward. And so I really think it's important to touch on vulnerability, because in order to truly connect to anyone, in order to truly learn anything, you must be willing to be vulnerable, because you have to accept that you don't know everything, and that is a vulnerable thing to admit. Vulnerability is, it's tough, right? Because vulnerability we tend to steer away from because we view vulnerability alongside weakness. So we often think, if I'm vulnerable, that means I'm weak and I'm not displaying strength, and so we kind of shy away from it. And yes, at the core of a lot of dark emotions is vulnerability, but in order to feel anything to its truest extent, you have to be vulnerable, both good or negative and positive emotions. It's the birthplace and the core of any true emotion. And that comes out of quite a lot of research as well, not just a claim. And is anyone a fan of Brené Brown? Yeah, okay, a few people. If you haven't looked up Brené Brown, she's phenomenal, and she does a lot of work around vulnerability. And like I said, I just want to foster connection throughout this workshop. That's all I really, really want to do when we talk about burnout, because we are going to talk about mental health issues and burnout and self-care, and that can be very vulnerable to do, whether you're sharing experiences of your own or talking about patients that you've seen or workplace colleagues. And on that note, I do want to say that this workshop is very what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So if somebody shares something with you, if you share something with the group, with somebody else, please just keep it to within the four walls of this workshop, and just respect the fact that someone has shared something with you, and then don't take it out of here. That applies for everybody except me. If I say something, you can tell anyone, that's fine. I am giving you consent to do that, and I do tend to ramble a bit. So as I said, vulnerability is really important, but we don't do it often enough, and I think especially as nurses, what we often do as nurses is demand vulnerability of the patients that we see and the people that we see, and then it becomes habit to know how to hold the space for somebody else to be vulnerable, but not practice that ourselves. Because interactions with patients requires a vulnerability on their part. We're asking some pretty big, heavy, serious questions, potentially not with a lot of chance to have built up a rapport, and we're kind of demanding that they go to that place where they're exposing themselves to us for their clinical benefit. And if you do that often enough in a day, which nurses do, then that's the habit that you build up, learning how to let others be vulnerable in front of you, but not being vulnerable in front of others. You do that 20 times a day with a patient. It's then very hard to reset that when you go into your own life and let someone hold the space for you. But it is very important, because we can't feel anything to its truest or connect to people without it. And I think it's also important because we need to be able to practice what we preach. If we're going to work with patients and we're going to encourage them to open up and be vulnerable, then we need to know how to do that as well. And we need to know how difficult, but also how joyous that experience can be. Part of the reason we don't do it more often is just purely around shame. When you're vulnerable, you're generally exposing something about yourself, and there's just that fear that it's going to be rejected and that people aren't going to be on board with that, and so we tend to shut that down because we're just scared that I will show this thing and someone will say, you're not this enough, you're not that enough, and so we kind of default back to just somewhat of a facade. Especially when you're a nurse and you're endowed with this status that nothing's wrong. Like, you are the holder of care and you're the service provider, and you're meant to be really strong, you're not meant to take sick days, you're not meant to have issues. I mean, anyone who is a healthcare worker, you are endowed with status when a patient is talking to you, and so it can be very hard then to take that vulnerability into real life. And so on that note, we're going to do a very, very quick activity around vulnerability. And again, the reason I want to do this is just to get us into the headspace of this workshop before we start. So, very, very short 5-minute activity on vulnerability. As I said, the reason that we often don't go to a place of vulnerability is because we don't want people to see these perceived weaknesses in ourselves. And it's us that's perceiving them as weaknesses, not other people. And so what I want to do is I want everyone to, in a moment, find a partner. It's not the right real setup to get around and find someone you don't know. So you can default to the person next to you. You can do groups of 3. I don't really mind how it works. And basically, you're going to share 2 things with that person or those people. You're going to share something that you want them to see about you, and then you're going to share something that you don't want them to see about you. This can be as in-depth and personal as you would like it to be. I would probably encourage you not to share your deepest, darkest secret with the person next to you. One, because it's quite an onus that you're putting on them. Also because you'll do that and then feel exposed, and then we'll move straight on through the workshop, and that's not the most conducive space to feeling good, but you can take that spectrum as much as you want to. Obviously, it's not going to end at those 2 sentences, or this activity will end in 20 seconds. The idea is just to learn what it feels like to hold the space for someone when they share something with you, and then what it feels like to have the space held for you as well, and see which one you find more challenging, if any of them. So when someone shares something with you, the first thing that you always have to do is thank them, because it's not easy to share anything, positive or negative. So thank them, validate them for that. And then what you don't do is try to fix that thing that they've identified. So if someone says something like, oh, I don't want you to see that I'm a bit socially anxious, the worst thing that you can do is be like, what? Oh my God, don't be that. No, you're amazing. You've got no reason to be that. No, you're fine. You're fine. It's because it's really invalidating, and it kind of takes away from the fact that they've shared something. So what you can do is employ curiosity. If someone shares something with you, just ask them questions about it. Do what nurses are great at doing anyway, and observe and do an assessment. why did you choose to share that with me? Why was that the thing you chose to share? How did it feel making you share that? Why do you feel like you're a bit socially anxious? Do you have any sort of past precedent for that? And then just see what they say and thank them again. So, for example, if I will use myself an example, and then no one needs to ask me questions, that's fine. I'd rather it be about you. If I was going to share with a partner, I would probably say, I want you to see that I'm confident. I don't want you to see that I deal with physical pain every day. And that's what I would share, and then we would kind of work through that together. As big a spectrum as you want it to be, it doesn't have to be that serious if you don't want it to be. So find a partner or a group of 3, and we'll do this for 5 minutes, and I'll scull some coffee, and then we'll see how we feel about it. Go. I know, I should just yell stop, but I also love connection and fostering connection, so I'm remiss to break up the conversations. All right, so I'll get everyone to bring it back in now. Thank you very much for sort of jumping in headfirst into that. I appreciate it's difficult right away at the start to do something interactive, potentially if it's someone you don't know as well. That is so bad. I fully thought that was a moment of applause, and I was like, no, you guys did the activity, not me. Thanks, though. So, before we move on, nurses are amazing because, while we dip into all of the STEM subjects in science, we also are very heavily based in the social sciences, and we're very good at generally talking. But did anybody find that challenging? Yeah? Okay. Well, that's good. That's sort of the idea as well. Who found it easier to listen to someone sharing something? Oh, okay, good. Good, because I always get nervous that if I can make people put their hands up, it will go the wrong way, and then I'll have nothing to say afterwards. Did anyone find it easier to share something than it was to listen? Okay. Yeah, a few, that's fine. Does anyone want to share any reflections on the activity or anything they really want to share about it? You don't have to. I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah, Ross.
Robbie, I think I want to say that Tony and I probably dominated the conversation.
I wouldn't believe it, Roz. I wouldn't believe it.
But when you started talking, I thought, oh my God, please, no, this is just unheard. But as you spoke through it, you wrote down that barrier for me. So that when I came to Tony and we met for the first time, I just, no. And that would never have happened. So thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Your words broke down those barriers. Thank you.
Oh, that's fine. Thanks. That's very kind. Thank you. I think to reflect on that, I think it's because when we know that we either have to share something or we have to listen to something that's going to be serious or not, there's just that innate pressure of what if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't know what to say? Because I think also as nurses we're compelled to want to fix things and make people feel better. The only thing I know to its truest extent is that very rarely is a response ever going to make something feel better. What you're actually doing is just showing to the person that you're connected to them and that you are practicing empathy, and that is much more powerful than any perfect sentence that you're going to be able to utter. Because someone doesn't want you necessarily to come in and give them advice and fix it. They just want to know that you're there and listening and connected to them. So thank you, I appreciate you saying that. Okay, so we'll move on. Don't worry, there's not interaction now until later on, so mostly you're good just to sit. Also, did anyone clock it that I was like, I'm going to go scoff coffee, and then literally spilled it all over myself as I went to walk? The camera will have. All right, so let's jump into what we're sort of talking about now, but keeping that connection and vulnerability at the headspace, at the forefront of your headspace as we talk about it. We're going to talk about burnout, and the reason that we're going to talk about burnout is because probably in no other profession is it experienced quite as profoundly as it is in nursing. It is a very, very prolific issue in the nursing industry, and it's one that, aside from just being a terrible personal experience to go through or to see somebody go through, it is and will and has affected retention and recruitment within the profession. And as we look at a future crisis of shortage of nurses, it's something that we really need to start thinking and talking about more openly and actively. So what is burnout? Burnout began, this is such a stock photo, but I couldn't find anything more not Grey's Anatomy. So burnout it was originally coined compassion fatigue, and that kind of says it all in the name there, but that term is still around but has sort of changed and evolved now into burnout. And research began in the 70s in fields associated with sort of high-intensity social interactions, nurses, teachers, counsellors. And the reason that this research began was because these industries and professions had very high turnover rates compared to other industries. And they were thinking, why? What is going on? Why are we losing people in these core caring professions? We need to figure out what's going on. When we talk about burnout, we will often talk about Maslach as the founder of burnout. Very, very amazing researcher from America, Christina Maslach, who sort of coined the term burnout and has created a lot of the tools that we still use. I always say we as if I'm one of those researchers, but I'm not. That people use to measure burnout, not just in nursing, but across all workplaces as well. And it's a very evolving, expanding area of research, especially as we look to, the pace of change within the workforce, not just in nursing, but in other ones, is so rapid. And we're seeing this big spike in startup and entrepreneurialism, and founders and entrepreneurs burn out very, very quickly and heavily as well. And so it's sort of pushing into those areas. And it continues to be a prominent an area of research in healthcare, because it's not like we had a retention and recruitment issue and now it's all good. It's still ongoing. We see it in our colleagues, we see it in colleagues that we lose, and news stories, and just the stats around the shortage in the profession. So what is it? This is just a couple of things that come to mind when you think of burnout. It's long-term. Like, we all experience workplace stress because being a nurse is stressful. In whatever capacity as a nurse you work in primary healthcare, whether it's clinically or through a PHN or through research or through whatever it is, workplace stress is involved. But burnout is long-term. It is an accumulation of workplace stress over a significant period of time that leads to physical, emotional, and mental fatigue. It's more than just your average stress, and it starts at work, usually. That's where we think about burnout. It begins in the workplace, but then it bleeds into everything else in life as well. If you are truly on that spectrum heading towards burnout, it is very difficult. It's uncommon for everything else in life to be going amazingly, and it's just as you step into the workplace that you're like, oh my God. And then you step out into the real world and you're like, I feel great now. It usually doesn't work like that. It kind of starts to bleed into all of your social interactions, family, relationships, friendships, and self-esteem and self-image as well, which then has a continual impact. But what else? I'm in a room full of nurses. There must be someone or people in here who have either seen and or experienced burnout. What words kind of, just like shout them out, come to mind when you think of burnout? Oh, I promise no more interaction. Now I'm like literally throwing it back onto you. They can be physical symptoms or ways that it looks, or literally anything. Like, what comes to mind when you think of burnout, when you hear it? Apathy. Yeah, totally. Really good.
Irritation.
Exhaustion, depletion.
Irritability.
Irritability. Oh my God, my resting state. What was that? Isolation, absolutely. Even if not physical isolation, very, very much isolating yourself, removing yourself, and just feeling completely disconnected. Disconnection. Any other? Loss of compassion. Yeah, absolutely. Which, if you're a nurse, is terrifying. It's a terrifying concept.
On the other end of the spectrum, like guilt.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. Because it's like the traits that drive us to nursing are often the ones that drive us to burnout as well. And so you start to feel all of those things, and then you start to feel really guilty about your practice, or lack of compassion, or feeling of disconnection, and you're like, oh, it's not about me, it's about the patient, I need to kind of get back into it. Yeah, for sure. So officially, burnout is a three-dimensional syndrome that involves a lot of all those things we were talking about, but it's these three main areas: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and nil personal accomplishment. And this comes from the Maslach burnout inventory that they created. So this is how they will categorize someone as officially being burnt out. So emotional exhaustion is all of those things we talked about: irritability, insensitivity, exhaustion, fatigue, lack of emotional intelligence, which again, if you're a nurse, is a terrifying concept. Depersonalization, my other word for that is cynicism, right? Again, you're looking at a very cynical human being, and I think a lot of nurses have that dark sense of humor and can be a little bit cynical, especially on like a Thursday, Friday, heading towards the weekend. It's just been one of those weeks, and you do start to become a little more dark and bleak about things, but it's sustained, right? It's just a real disconnection from the work that you're doing, not caring about the patients, not caring about your colleagues. Apathy, I think was sort of the first word that was thrown out. It is just a real lack of care and lack of connection to what you're doing. And if you're someone who works in health, that is the complete opposite, I would imagine, of why you got into it in the first place. I can't imagine there are many nurses in here that are like, I got in it for the money. I have sad news for you. No, it's connection. It's about caring about people. And nil personal accomplishment is a lack of satisfaction in what it is that you're doing. You no longer take pride in your work. You no longer feel accomplished. You're not satisfied. And then on top of that, you usually start to make mistakes as well, probably because you're exhausted, and burnout goes from an emotional, mental place into being a physical place, makes you usually absent from work quite a bit, manifests in a lot of physical illnesses, colds, worn down immune system, memory loss, and just being a bit fuzzy, and then you start to make mistakes, and then you feel guilty, and then, all compounds on top of each other. And these are the 6 sort of official reasons why we burn out. This is from the Areas of Work-Life Survey, which is also a Maslow tool. Workload, control, reward, community, fairness, and values. These 6 things kind of make up why someone might burn out. You don't necessarily need all of them ticked. I would hope not. And they'll affect different people at different times. So workload is how much work and what type of work are you doing. So that's often a huge one for nurses, workload, because how much work do you have? Oh, I nearly swore really badly then. Is anyone very averse to swearing? Great. Yes, someone said yes, then I won't do it. No? Okay. Because it's always on the tip of my tongue. There's always a swear word nearly there, but I'm conscious to not upset and isolate anybody. So how much work do you have as a nurse? Tons, because you're usually understaffed. Tons, because you're usually understaffed. I mean, if we're talking about primary healthcare specifically, is there anyone here who is the only nurse in their clinic? Oh, amazing. Okay, that's quite a good ratio, yeah, a few people. Then the amount of work that you have is usually quite hectic, but would anyone here claim that they need more nurses in their clinic? Yeah, cool. Because you're such a middle person in primary healthcare nursing. You just sit right in the middle and you have to liaise with everyone, and it means the kind of work that you've got on your plate is usually a lot to deal with. And the type of work that you're doing as a nurse is highly emotive, and that is very exhausting. Right? Do not underestimate how exhausting and fatiguing practicing empathy constantly is. It just takes so much of you to go down to that place to be able to properly connect to a patient, and we do not pat ourselves enough on the back for it. The kind of work that you're doing, even if it's a really simple interaction where you don't feel like you're doing any deep diving, it's like a simple flu vaccine. Again, just holding that space for someone and making them feel safe and making them feel like you've got it under control and that you're competent and kind and all of those things takes a lot of work, and that's exhausting. Control is about decision making. Do you in your workplace have the capacity to make decisions that will inform your practice and how the clinic is running? If you do, amazing. If you don't, that's super annoying. And that can wear on you over time because you have all these ideas. I mean, that's often the theme of this conference. Oh my gosh, primary healthcare nurses have so many ideas about how we can improve primary care, but we are not able to implement them because either we don't have the funding or we are not given the status within the clinic to be able to do that. Reward is financial and social reward. So are you paid appropriately for the work that you're doing? No, is the answer. And I am cognizant of the fact that we have come a very long way in terms of nursing wages from what they have been in the past to what they are now. It's a massive increase, but I still don't think for the type of work that you're doing, it's appropriate compensation. And then on top of that, in primary healthcare, it's usually less than the tertiary space as well. And social reward. Are you properly validated in your workplace when you do a good job? Or do you work incredibly hard and do your best to provide amazing care and get the clinic running and it just kind of goes unnoticed? And I'm not saying that you do work in order to get reward, but validation is important because it means that you are being recognized and it means that someone's able to provide you feedback. So are you lacking those things? If so, you're likely to head towards burnout. Community, do you have a good community around you? Imagine if every clinic just had as an amazing community as an APNA conference. It'd be a pretty lovely place to work, but it's not always like that. Fairness is about equitable treatment across the workplace. Do people get treated the same and get the same privileges in the workplace? Or do you find someone tends to get away with things more than other people? Is that you? Are you able to get away with things a lot more than some of your colleagues, maybe due to seniority or a closer relationship with the practice manager or things like that? You kind of need to be conscious not just of how it's affecting you, but how it's affecting those around you as well. And values. Does your work align with your values? Usually, if you're a nurse, the answer is yes. Like I said, it's uncommon that you're getting into nursing for fiscal reward. It's usually because you care about people, and as a nurse, you get to practice that. But often as a primary care nurse, you can find that some of the tasks that you're doing you can get pushed away from that value space as well, because they just see you sometimes in certain clinics, I will say, not all of them, they just see you as an extra person to do extra things that they don't know who to assign to. And so you find that all of a sudden what you want to be doing is clinically upskilling and working with patients and doing stuff like that, but you find all of a sudden it's become very administrative heavy, or they've chucked you on reception because they're short-staffed and they just don't really see the boundary and the line between those things, or yeah, you're just doing stuff that doesn't necessarily align with the reasons you got in the first place. Anyone want to jump in with any questions, reflections at any point? Feel free. At any moment, just put your hand up. Okay, so what does burnout look like? Because I think you can talk about it and you can throw all the words out and whatnot, but if you haven't seen it, experienced it, lived it, seen someone go through it, it can be very hard to sort of properly fathom the massive impact that it can have on your health long term as well. So I thought I would give you a case study because we are nurses and nurses love case studies. Oh, don't we just? What a presentation with a case study, how wonderful. So innovative. So I think we all, this is a scenario that I think actually a lot of people will probably remember. It was pretty prominent, it was pretty much everywhere. And it is a really good example of what it can look like and how bad it can go. As I said, it was pretty prolific, it was pretty much documented everywhere. It was a particularly dark moment in history, I think. It was quite a serious event. And I'm of course talking about Brittany's 2007 meltdown. Right? So, I really hyped that up there. Does everyone remembers this? Yeah, right, okay. So I'm not actually putting this in for comic value, I promise. There's a real reason that I actually chose this. One, because I really thinking about it, this is probably the most visible form of burnout that I think anyone has probably seen, right? This was everywhere, massive, and it really, I mean, you couldn't really turn on any news or open any magazines without seeing it. It was incredibly traumatic as well for this person living through it. I think the other reason that I chose it as well is because how quickly after this happened did it become a joke? Really fast. It became a constant punchline. It was just like featured all over, people like making jokes about having Brittany breakdowns and things like that. And I think even though this was over 10 years ago, I still think we have so much stigma around mental health and about visibly reaching out and saying that you need help that we prefer to turn it into a joke. It's very hard to take, because we don't like being vulnerable, because it requires empathy. And in order to properly connect to someone who's going through something serious, you need to go down to a place within yourself where even if you haven't gone this bad, you have experienced something like it to be able to make you feel connected to them. But even still, has all the tick marks for burnout, like physical, emotional exhaustion, went to rehab for exhaustion, affect career, long-term health outcomes, loss of status as well. And in a weird way this might be a bit of a stretch, but between celebrity and nursing, I think as a nurse, especially for me as a primary care nurse, it's usually only me on in the shift in the clinic, and I just constantly struggle with the feeling like I can't not be there. But if I'm not there, then there's no nurse. So what's gonna happen, right? Like you call in sick to a tertiary facility, well that sucks because they are usually understaffed and the ratios aren't amazing. But there might be a casual pool or an agency nurse or, that at least there'll be a team trying to pick up the slack, and that's not great, but there's gonna be other people there. Whereas often in primary care, there isn't anybody else there. It's just you, and if you don't show up, you think about those patients who are booked in, what's gonna happen, they're gonna have to be rescheduled, oh my God, and so you just generally tend to suck it up, even though you probably need a mental health day. And as I said, this might also be a weird thing to say, but I think part of the reason this became a joke as well so quickly to people was because, feel free for someone to jump in if they feel like I'd be corrected, but I think obviously we have stigma around mental health, but I think on top of that, to acknowledge intersectionality, much more so against women. I think, and there's so many historical patriarchal roots for that, but if any women have sort of expressed the need for space or a mental health day or want to talk about mental health issues, it's been so easy societally to put labels on that and to try and turn it into something like a punchline, because like it's rooted in society and the patriarchy to sort of keep women out of certain areas that they didn't want that. And I think as a female-dominated profession with the most like brilliant, wise, amazing minds working in primary healthcare, and a lot of that is mental health, there's a real opportunity to bash through that stigma, especially the stigma targeted at women for mental health. So why do nurses burn out? The actual thing that should say is why not? Because there's probably more reasons why we do than don't. These are just the most common ones that I have pulled out of literature, but I'll see if there's any others that people think there are. So they're not in any particular order of like importance or relevance, I've just sort of chucked them in there. Working with vulnerable populations is a reason that you can experience burnout, because again, that's highly emotive work when you're working with people. Like, what's one common vulnerable population that all of us work with? Elderly children. No, think bigger, think way more broad. GPs. Hilarious. That's amazing. I wish that was my answer. Yes. Sick people. We work with people who are unwell, and when you are unwell, that is an incredibly vulnerable space to inhabit, to admit that you need it. And that's why a lot of people don't access care, because they don't like feeling vulnerable, because they think they think people perceive them as weak. And so when someone does come to you and you're working with someone who's unwell, they're already in a space of vulnerability, and so you need to, again, practice vulnerability, connection, empathy, and that is tiring and exhausting. As I've said and harped on a million times, practicing active empathy is really, really difficult, and it is very, very exhausting, and it is a real art, and nurses are exceptionally good at it, but it is absolutely going to wear you down. Like, how often has anyone just like ever gotten to the end of a shift that was particularly emotive, and you just like that? Yeah, you just don't have words, and then you go home and maybe someone's like, "How was your day? Like, are you thinking about cooking dinner? What's going on? Blah 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 blah." And you're like, "Get away from me! Like, I have no more space left. My cup has like runneth over. There is nothing left for me to give." And we take that feeling as like part and parcel of the job, but that's not how everyone is at the end of their workday. And you work for long enough as a nurse and a primary care nurse that you sort of take it for granted that I'm just meant to feel like this every now and then. But I can tell you, like, I've had, like, you'll finish a shift and then I've booked a dinner with a friend and we're comparing work days. I'm not saying that you should compare work days, but in terms of actually having to practice active empathy, we do it so often in a day. Like, it's phenomenal how often and regularly we have to do it, when in real life, most people might have to do it, like, truly going to that place, like, twice a week, you know what I mean? Like 2-3 times a week, really? But we might have to do it 10 times a day. And you think about some of the horrific things that you have to see and stories that you hear in that space that you have to hold. Do not undervalue the toll that takes on you and the validation that you deserve for it. Dealing with difficult patients and families, need I say more? Workplace environment. So the environment, the physical space that you work in can really impact on your mental health for lots of different reasons. Does anyone work in a clinic that clearly was not set up to have a nurse? I do. Okay, well that's encouraging. Both clinics that I have worked in concurrently are clearly like, oh, we've got a nurse, and so let's just like find an empty space for them, but it's not properly set up as a treatment room the way a treatment room should be set up. But workplace environment also extends to workplace culture. Like, what's the culture like? Is it really warm and friendly and full of connection and community, or is there a bit of workplace harassment, bullying, eating the young? Do you have an appropriate mentor in your workspace? Are you a mentor to someone? Is that something that's lacking? Hours and shifts, this affects nurses a lot, generally not so much in primary care. Not for everyone, because some people work in facilities that work weekends and evenings, and then shift work obviously is going to wear you down, but thankfully for primary care it's not too bad. Personality attributes, because like I said, the reasons that you probably chose nursing are also the reasons that you might then start to burn out, because you're used to because you care about people and you want to help people and you're used to putting other people first and not yourself. Being expected to deviate from accepted practice, that is something that will very also quickly lead to workplace stress and burnout. And how often in a workplace do you do something that you just like know isn't 100% by the guideline, but you do it because it's faster or because someone tells you to? Yeah, please tell me this isn't just me. No? Okay. And they're going to be big and small. It can be big and small, how that works. But every time that you do that, and you know that you're going against what is supposed to be that, you know, perfect guideline, which just like doesn't translate to the clinical setting, still takes a toll, wears away, builds workplace stress. And of course, a huge amount of workplace stress because we're registered health professionals. And so you constantly have that thing in the back of your head, like, you know, could this impact my registration? Am I current with my practice as well? Which leads me to the pace of change. How often do you feel like you've just mastered something clinically, and then they're like, new guideline? Constantly. And I'm like, I just learned that's how I was supposed to treat chronic leg ulcers. Damn, and now it's the complete opposite. Or like, we indicate this medication for heart disease, and then 10 years later they're like, jokes, that causes heart disease. Cease everyone. So it can be clinically like that, and the pace of change, like keeping up to date and your CPD up to date, can be really exhausting. I mean, some of the sessions here are so phenomenal, and you want to be able to attend all of them because you're like, I need a refresher in that, I need a refresher in that, I need a refresher in that, because you live with that weight of knowing that you need to keep up with everything and have best practice. For that, I would say just reach out to people who are nursing experts in that field and get advice for them. But also the pace of change in terms of technology. Like we're living in the fourth industrial revolution, and no more has technology ever boomed than it is booming now, and that is quite a difficult thing to master as well. Anyone have any others that they think like that isn't on there? Yeah. Time pressure. Totally, absolutely. Knowing that in a care plan I should be spending this amount of time with someone, but yeah, I feel that doesn't happen. I feel like someone's laughing. They could have just been a joke that was told to them, but. Often you're like, I need 20 minutes to do this, and they're like, cute, here's 5, right? or you could, if you wanted to, spend that time with them, but you also look out in the waiting room and you know you've got 5 more people waiting. And so you balance that in your head, like, oh God, okay, so if I kind of deviate this time, but I don't want to keep them waiting, what if they leave? That's an awful feeling. When you have spent a lot of time with that, and then you go out to get that patient and they're gone because they didn't want to wait, and then you're like, oh, I lost that chance. Someone else? Yeah.
Living and working in a small community where you actually know a lot of your patients and family, family as well as friends.
Yeah, absolutely. And in primary care, the demands of the community as well. But yeah, absolutely. Family, friends, privacy issues. I know because my background is sexual health, and there's been some alarming rates specifically around syphilis in Indigenous communities in Australia. But part of that and what they're trying to figure out and combat is because the stigma that's associated with sexual health of being seen going to the clinic or having it be spoken amongst family, and then that exists in rural and remote areas just generally anyway. Someone else? That's something, yeah.
Just going to say, in regards to workplace environment, also the others that you work with, so whether it's not, we always have problems with GPs, but even the administration staff. So we talk about time pressures a lot in our practice because of the way the administrative staff are booking our appointments. And booking and not having the consideration or understanding of how it affects our workload.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Your interdisciplinary relationships. And it's like you're such a peacekeeper as I don't know, like I feel like I'm a bit of a people pleaser and a peacekeeper, and you don't want to ruffle the feathers, which all of you will laugh at because like that's probably not how I present, but I usually am a bit of like a softer kind of peacekeeper type person. And so you don't want to ruffle feathers, and I always go, if anything happens, I'm like, oh yeah, I will talk to them. Or like, oh, maybe it was just this one-off instance. I'll see if it happens again. And then it happens again too many times that it's now become a pattern, and that's so much harder to undo. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Totally. The pressure you put on yourself to be perfect. Absolutely. Which I think every nurse feels innately to the core. To be the most clinically competent, the most kind, the most caring, the most empathetic, the most... and then, of course, if you're talking about, like we are here, building the image and the scope of primary care nurses, also being the most vocal and the most active and just all that kind of pressure that you put on yourself. And it can become quite crippling because... I'm going to steal a point from later, but our self-talk as nurses can be really destructive. Like the voice that we have in our head, the way we talk to ourselves can be really, really damaging. But I will extend back to that later. So I mean, all of those reasons, which I have like a million anecdotes that I could talk about. Like, here's one. This kind of is interdisciplinary stress mixed with emotive environment, mixed with time pressure. And it's the most recent one that springs to mind. I will say I will give a slight trigger warning that it does involve a patient who had some serious mental health issues, and I'm going to mention suicide. I was in my treatment room, and I don't know, I'm sure doing something serious, and got a call or reception came in, one of the receptionists came in and goes, oh, I've just triaged someone who, they're just not feeling that well, so I've just put them in an empty room. Can you just go and check on them? And I was like, yep, I can do that. What do you mean unwell? And she was like, oh, just, like looked a bit pale, just said he was feeling well, I don't know, like maybe a bit nauseous or something. I was like, cool, amazing. So I like grabbed my vomit bag and I like head to the consult room and I burst in like all sunshine, like, hi, I'm Robbie, I'm one of the nurses here. I heard you're not feeling well today. What's going on? Like, awful. Gross. And then, you know, I kind of burst in all sunshine at like an 11 out of 10. And then he sort of like turns, I imagine quite affronted, and he sort of turns to me and goes, oh yeah, no, I'm not feeling well. 2 days ago, I attempted suicide and I just don't feel like sitting in the waiting room with a bunch of people. And then the whole thing kind of shifted. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to take you out of this room and I'm going to take you to my treatment room and like, let's have a chat. So then I've gone in unprepared, like completely unprepared for that consult. I have like gone in on the wrong foot. I have probably put that person on the spot potentially to share something they had no intention to share with anybody potentially but the GP. And so then I brought him into the treatment room and then found out that sort of the means by that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the method involved like quite a lot of wounds and they hadn't really been cared for properly in the hospital. So I was like, all right, what I can do now is wound care for you while we have a chat. It took 45 minutes, I would say, from the moment I took him in to do all of the wound care as well as the counselling and whatnot. And then the whole time that was happening, my phone kept constantly ringing because there were like more patients being dumped outside to the point where without asking, someone comes in the room and goes, while the patient is exposed, and goes, you've got 4 patients waiting. Like, what's going on? Do you know what I mean? And like, that is an extreme example, right? So I'm obviously using hyperbole here, but all of those things that start to compound on top of each other, and then you just kind of have to wear all of that, and it can be very difficult because that's so multi-layered. It was inappropriate triage, it was an inappropriate handover, it was a highly emotive situation, it was a time-pressured long consult, like it was all of them confounding. And maybe that's rare, but it can happen, and it can happen to every practice nurse, and we can all think of those scenarios where all of a sudden the dominoes fall, and it's just such an intense, stressful experience. And if you don't have the proper support structure around you or preventative measures set up, you have enough of those in a row with all the small ones in between of those things individually as well, and then it's easy to see how it can start leading to something more serious like burnout. I will end that on a happy note. We, aside from that interruption, had a really beautiful consult, has come back a bunch of times and is doing much better. So why should we care about burnout, except for just the fact that we obviously should? Retention and recruitment is a big one, and I will go into that on the next slide. But like we can't have nurses leaving the profession. I know that sounds like a redundant thing to say, but we just can't. We have a shortage and it's getting worse, and the more nurses that are subjected to workplace and emotional stress and burnout and leave, the worse it's going to be for our healthcare system. It affects patient outcomes. If you're experiencing burnout or any of the things that go along with burnout, you're not as good a clinician, and you can make mistakes, and it can impact on the service that your clinic and you are providing. And also, my motto in life is that there's no healthcare without self-care, which I think I made up, but could have also read somewhere. I fully claim it as mine. But we're representatives for health. Like, we are representatives and advocates for health. So if we can't practice this, then how are we going to inspire that in our patients to do the same? Like, I've been full-blown, super anxious in the middle of consults, just thinking about a million things, and have the audacity to look at a patient and be like, I really think we need to talk about mindfulness today. Right? So audacious, while I'm like, having a full-blown panic attack in my head. And so we need to kind of learn how to do that better if we actually want to inspire that in other people. And this is just to give you an idea of why I keep calling it a shortage and crisis. So predicted in 2025, we will be down 85,000 nurses of what we need. And then in 2030, that'll be down 122,000 nurses that we need across the country. Like, it's a terrifying statistic when we already are understaffed and the ratios in tertiary settings and aged care facilities are not appropriate, and in primary care we're trying to inspire people because we want to make real change for preventative and community health. Like, I don't know, I find that scary, and I feel like compelled to act, and I think one of those ways is to start talking more openly about stress and mental health and burnout. So what can we do? Because it's no good just to like talk about all the bad and the negative and then not give us like tips and tools to get better at, right? Tips for self-care. So cute. So my first tip is to kind of to link off what I think you said about about pressure on yourself. To start by being really kind to yourself, and the way to do that is to talk to yourself the way that you talk to other people, right? Or imagine talking to other people the way that you talk to yourself. And if you're someone who has a really, really good inner monologue going and you've like worked very hard, then the way you're going to talk to other people is going to be beautiful. If I spoke to other people the way that I will talk to myself, no friends. You know what I mean? Like isolated from my family, like, you know, the whole thing. Because we just are so hard on ourselves. You don't achieve something, it didn't go the way you wanted it to, you didn't remember that thing, and you just beat yourself down with negative self-talk, and that becomes a pattern. It becomes very hard to break. So the first tip is always to talk to yourself the way that you talk to other people. And it's very artificial at first, and you can do it out loud, but really validate and congratulate yourselves for things, and then you'll start to shift that. I've split these into work and life, but they actually all overlap anyway, but it's just a slightly easier way to think about it. So some of the ways that you can build up self-care, and this works as well no matter where on the spectrum you are. So they're not just preventative measures. If you're someone who literally right now is in the middle of feeling incredibly stressed and overwhelmed, and you feel like this is something that you're heading towards and it's ringing very scarily true, you can also employ these to help get you out of it. Boundaries, it's again like a dirty word, kind of like vulnerability, but building boundaries around yourself, knowing your limitations in the workplace is very important. Like, know what your scope of practice is, whether you want to improve it or you're being asked to do things outside your scope. Boundaries for me as well, like being asked to do things that aren't actually within your role, but they just push you into it because they need an extra person. So use your entitlements as well, and I'll put regular breaks, not regular vacations, because sometimes it's not just, you can't just go on a holiday anytime you feel a bit stressed, if only. So take a mental health day, or a RDO, or a day off. Or if you, that's actually a really personal question, so I'm not going to force you to tell people. If you're like me, who is casually employed through every clinic that I have ever worked at, I have never been offered a contract, then the thought of taking a mental health day not only is that pressure of but then there's no nurse that day, it's also then financial, because you're but then I lose income. And you know what's stressful? Having no money. But you build it into your roster. Because what's more costly than losing one day of pay is having your mental health deteriorated, and then the financial burden that goes along with reaching burnout as well. Avoid task switching, because that makes you anxious. So try not to do, I know this doesn't always work, but try not to do a million things at once at work. Don't be in the middle of replying to an email and then answer the phone, but then also be talking to the practice manager while you're reading the consult notes for the next person to come in. Because guilty, a couple of people. So, because it splits your brain, it makes you not mindful, and that makes you anxious. It's just the way the brain works. So you just try to focus on one thing at a time, and it is very difficult to do, but if someone is interrupting you, you say, cool, I'm going to get to that later, I'm in the middle of doing this. The amount of times, again, people will walk into my room and be like, there's a patient waiting, and I'll go, I know, I'm finishing this note. And initially, you get that kind of bristle, that someone bristles, but the more you do it, it just becomes known that that is your pattern and that is how you work. People also know that for me, because my motto in life is, aside from the original one, is dance like no one's watching and write notes like it's being read out in coroner's court. So my notes are crazy. They're full-blown essays, but so people know to leave me alone then. Automate and delegate. If there's something, because if this is about letting go of control, if there's something you don't have to do, but you're just doing it because you feel like no one's going to do it better than you, delegate it. If there's somebody else who can actually do it, then do it. If you, and automate, one of the best things I found, speaking of note-taking, was learning how to use my practice software to its fullest extent. Yeah, medical director, best practice, whatever it is that you're working with, if you are working with electronic software, it can do such amazing things if someone comes in and teaches you how to do those things. And when I learned the autofill thing, Oh my God, my world changed. And it literally lifted so much stress off me to write dot, ear syringe, and then this whole thing comes in that I just like fill in the blanks for or whatever it is instead of trying to remember it all for that day in coroner school. And I would say I think your PHN can come and do training in that. Yes, I'm getting it on. Develop a career plan, and then in life, again, it's a bit of an obvious one, but like get out of your head and into your body and exercise and be physical or just be active, right? It doesn't have to be a full-blown like heavyweight champion activity kind of thing. You just go out for a walk, you get active, preferably do it outdoors because that makes you mindful, because in a gym it's very easy to like have a podcast going while you're looking at the paper and there's like a million distractions around you. When you're outside, you kind of have to be mindful or you're going to trip over a rock and fall. So it kind of forces you into that headspace. And I would encourage people, does anyone know the Nurse Strong campaign? Yeah? Anyone has not heard of Nurse Strong? Amazing. So the Australian College of Nursing, ACN, has just launched this thing called Nurse Strong, which is basically a nationwide campaign trying to encourage nurses to be more active. And they set monthly challenges that you can sign up to, and they'll send you resources and materials for them, as well as like sharing the best apps for fitness and things like that. It was launched by their CEO, Kylie Ward, a couple months ago. So I would look that up, Nurse Strong, through the ACN. The April challenge is a walking challenge. I think Kat has signed up to it. So whoever does the most steps in the month of April will win a prize. And it's cool stuff like that. And it builds community as well. Nutrition is really important. If you are tired, like when I'm tired, you know what I want? Cake. But you know what's not good to eat in that moment? Refined sugar, because it makes you more tired. So, which is like so obvious, but often not easy, especially if you're very, very busy. It can be very hard to do proper meal plans. And when patients want to thank you, they often bring you like chocolates or something sweet or whatever. But if you're feeling very fatigued and very exhausted, my advice would be avoid processed foods and refined sugars because they just chemically make you feel much, much worse. Find the right support network and talk it out. I've left this intentionally quite vague because it's really different for every person. So in the plenary session, they were talking about the importance of having a mentor, and I very much strongly agree with that. I don't think you have to have one. I think you can have lots of them. I don't think it matters what age they are, whether they're older, younger, their level of experience. And there's also great joy in mentoring people as well, so don't discredit your own expertise. But the right support network is super, super individual. So I, sometime in February, talked about burnout for a group of nurses and pharmacists working in HIV, and I did this slide, and then it ended, and then it was question time, which is always terrifying, and someone at the back was like, and you know it's always bad when they go, great talk, but, and that's the kiss of death. And so he was like, great talk, but I've been a nurse for 40 years, and my background's sexual health and HIV, but decades ago when we'd practice through the hospital, and then if there was a crisis in ED, they'd just pull the sexual health nurses and we'd work in ED, and we saw the most awful, horrendous things, and we had to deal with it. And you know what we did? We all just went to the pub. We all just went to the pub and had a pint afterwards and chatted about it, and then we were all fine. And look, I don't want to say it, but I think new nurses are just a bit soft, and you've lost the ability to have an informal debrief and chat to your colleagues. And then you just kind of mic drop. And I, very diplomatic, was like, thanks for your contribution. Yes, and. I was like, cool, so, because I think truly, honestly, for him that worked. And that's fine, because I reckon he's probably got a very strong base level of resilience. He's probably he's lasted in the career for 40 years, which is a testament that because a lot of nurses get burnt out. So he's probably at a baseline very resilient, and he just requires an informal debrief, and that's enough for him. But what I said to him was like, great, you're resilient and that works for you. I wonder if you can confidently tell me it worked for all other 9 people at the table. And how did you measure that? Because statistically, a lot of those people are not nursing anymore, if you just look at the stats. So for you, that was great, but you had no metrics to measure whether it was successful for other people. And they might have been like, yeah, cool, and then they go home and internalize all this stress. So you find what's right and what works for you. It could be an informal debrief at the pub. I love a rant over wine. But I also love peer-based supervision, and I also think there's a lot of power in acknowledging that you need help and chatting to someone professionally, accessing a GP mental health care plan if you feel like that's where it's heading. There are so many different ways that you can do it, and I actually encourage you to find that network here at this conference as well, because you may not always find the support where you're meant to, right? It should come through your clinic and through your workplace and be formal, but it's not always there. Like, I don't think at my clinic I could really access peer-based supervision that I would need strongly, but look at all these amazing peers around you that you can network with, find, and reach out to. Social media is very powerful for that as well. Rose, who's at the back, has created a phenomenal Facebook community for nurses in her region in New South Wales that is a really strong community, shares resources, shares tips, can chat. There's lots of power in networking like this, conferring at a conference, if you will. Oh, we're crushing it for time. Oh no, it's the interactive component. Oh my God. Lock the doors. Before we move on though to the interactive component, are there any others that people want to share that they're like, this has worked really well for me, I've seen this work for somebody else? Please. Yeah. Oh, thanks. I love you. Great panel earlier.
Young fella, I'm just in all, you do a great job and I watch all your hotline and stuff. You're doing amazing stuff in general practice. And you help a lonely country girl like me just keep hanging in on the hard days. Even though I got up on that panel and things all seemingly amazing and like I'm a little bit of cheer, someone had to show me how to use a 6 in the bathroom.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Of my time in general practice where I sat in the car and cried before I got to work.
Yeah.
I have 2 daughters that are now 14 and 12, and there's been times where I felt like I couldn't leave the workplace and my kids slept on their swags in the tea room because my husband was busy at work and there was no other nurse, so I did an AQA shift. I developed type 2 cardiomyopathy and had cardiac troponins of over 5,000 and was put into a coronary heat unit for 3 weeks. So for all that sick leave that I didn't take, they then had to pay to me, unfortunately, take the time and look after yourself because that was a shit house lesson for me and my family. I nearly lost my life over looking after everybody else's. Coming to things like this stops you feeling alone. Naomi's my new BFF. Keeping her in general practice. And I think by sharing our vulnerability and the things that we find difficult, and I thank you, Robbie, for your honesty and sharing your tricky story, especially with your client that was in a very vulnerable position. And I'm sorry, my friend, you came 15 out of 10 in that situation into that room.
Yeah.
And I like that you make 15 out of 10 every single day of your life. I think it's important that we share that vulnerability because I find if I have a weakness and someone else has a strength, I don't find that intimidating. I find that someone I can learn from. Also, I know love you. And that's my little story about vulnerability and difficulties in general practice. You can feel very alone. You can feel very precious, but we do have to look after ourselves and love is really important. So check out Hot on Hill.
Oh. Don't plug me at the end. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, thank you. That was really powerful. And I think also really humanized a lot of what we're trying to talk about today. And something that I want to reflect on is that it can feel very abstract when you're talking about burnout, and it can feel very like, yes, mental and emotional stress, but like I'll push through whatever. But I really will emphasize it goes from mental and emotional stress into physical health. Like if it goes on long enough, it will compromise your physical health potentially to a very, very serious extent where you can be hospitalized, you could develop long-term issues and then not be able to get back to the level of work that you wanted to. And that's why it's, I mean, aside from all the other reasons, it's so important. Like it really can, we're so lucky sort of to, this sounds a bit new age, I guess, but we are very lucky to like be alive and have bodies that work. And so I always say, if you're talking about exercise, like you shouldn't exercise because you hate your body, you should exercise because you love your body. And I think it's the same thing about your mental health as well and thinking about burnout. Like you should do it because you love yourself and the work that you do. And we are very like lucky, otherwise it can go sort of a very darker point. So, what are we gonna do now? Oh my God, we're gonna keep talking to each other. Here's a trusty pain scale that we all love, just like a case study. So, what I want to do is sort of reflect on what was just said about connection and why this conference is so amazing, because we have the chance to actually talk to each other and connect. This activity involves a little bit of vulnerability because you have to acknowledge a moment. I made this activity up, so please feel free to give me feedback at the end if it doesn't work. You have to acknowledge there are potentially things that are not going the way that you would like them to go for you. That's how this activity works. And then you're going to talk about that with people and you're going to build goals around it. So essentially, we've got like the 4 components of life, which is how it's most often broken up in the literature: work, love, money, and health. Apparently it's all that simple. You've got those 4 areas. Does anyone have something to write with? Maybe, if not, that's not actually too big a problem. So what you're going to do is you're going to, post-it notes. Does anyone need something to write with? You can also just remember it as well if you want to. It's not, I'm not going to get super complicated on this. All right, so the way that this is going to work is you've got these 4 areas. And what I want you to do is next to the 4 areas, I want you to put a number from 0 to 10, matching the pain scale. Right, so I'm going to double mic this because I'm not good with instructions. So you've got your 4 areas of life, and next to those you put a number from 0 to 10. And we're going to work with the pain scale, right? So the lower the number, this is a bit sort of a backwards way to think, but the lower the number, the better that is going for you, right? And then, because we're working with or would people rather just do it reverse? All right, because the scale's here for reference. So if it's going low, then it's great, right? Because you're feeling no pain in that area. All the way up to 10 where you're feeling the most pain in that area. And you're going to rate yourself from 0 to 10 in these 4 areas. So for me, I would probably rate, I don't know, like work a 4, love a 3, money a 9, and health a 6, I guess, is where I would fall on that. So for me, out of those 4 areas, it would be money and health that were the ones that needed the most work. So I'll give you guys a second to do that. And then just put your hand up when you're done. I will say this sounds like a very easy thing to do, but it is very difficult to look inwards and accept when there are things that might need change and room for growth. So do take your time doing this. You don't have to put an arbitrary score. You also, as I said, only have to be as vulnerable as you choose. We're not here to, you don't have to share your deepest, darkest secrets with someone. So if one of those areas is actually a 10 for you, but you don't want to put it all the way as a 10, that's totally fine.
Have you got counsellors on standby?
Well, here's a great plug, right? Has anyone ever heard of nurse midwife support? Yeah? Has anyone not heard of nurse midwife support, the organisation? Okay, nurse midwife support, I'm talking while you're trying to do something. But anyway, Nurse Midwife Support is an amazing organisation that was created out of the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Board and Council. And it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week phone counselling service for nurses and midwives, staffed by nurses and midwives who are trained in counselling. And you can call them about literally anything at any point in time and any issue you're having to talk it out. And then they also have a whole amazing bunch of resources on their website and a podcast that you can listen to as well to learn about self-care and mental health. I would encourage you to look that up. Nurse and midwife support. Is everyone ready? Have they done their scales? Cool, amazing. So the way this is going to work, you're going to have to get up and move. So grab your stuff if you want to. What you're going to do is you are going to find yourself in a group of people who have rated one area the highest, just like you. And then when you go into that group, you can either do it as a group or you can, again, pair off, find groups of 3, and you're just going to workshop a strategy together, make yourself accountable to each other, just to move 1 point down the scale. It doesn't have to be a huge, dramatic increase or decrease or anything like that, and I'll go back to the slide with all of the tips. Does that sound incredibly terrifying? Good. I won't be doing it. So what I want to do is if you rated work as the highest up in the pain scale, I want you to stay in that back corner just there. If you rated love, and I should say love covers everything, so it's like relationships, family, partnerships, anything like that. Doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't found it, but just that you might not have the time to devote for it or might not be getting out of it in the same way you want to. And if that's where you've rated it the highest, I want you to come here to the front. If money is the biggest issue for you and the biggest pain at the moment, you go to that back corner just there. And if it's health, then you come to this front corner just here. Go. And then okay. And then once you've found your tribe, I will say, like, already you have displayed vulnerability because you're, like, showing it out loud to people. Find someone, pair off, groups of 3, do whatever, and then you workshop strategies just to come a little bit down the scale. And maybe also swap details because you're forming a network as well. All right, so while everyone's grabbing their seats, I just don't want to bleed into lunchtime and or not give people a chance to ask questions or reflect or anything like that. Thank you for engaging in that activity as everyone did, and as passionately as everyone did. Looks like there were some really good conversations going on. I hope that was the case. I know that's not enough time to debunk all of those issues that you're working through, but the whole point is that that is just a launch pad for the fact that we're still here for another 2 days together. So it doesn't have to just be that small kind of 5-10 minute window that you had just then to chat about that one thing. We've just spent 90 minutes talking about burnout and stress and forming connections, and you've just started talking to those people, so you can continue those conversations through the next 2 days. I'm just going to end before some questions. So cute. By just saying that, like, obviously this is great because we've all been here, and if you're experiencing this, you can hopefully take on some of those tips, or you've learned something, but it might not actually be you that ends up needing the help or the tips or the support. It can be the people around you as well. And some of the things that I've been talking about or you've been discussing, you might actually be recognizing not in yourself, but in people in your life or the people around you or your colleagues. And if that is the case, all I would say is just start the conversation. Reach out to someone and talk to them, because you don't know how important that's going to be for them that you opened that avenue of communication, because there's, like I said, a lot of guilt for some reason that goes with all the stigma that goes along with mental health or mental health issues or stress or just admitting that you need help. There's a lot of guilt and shame that's tied up with that, and so we're not often the ones to reach out. As I said, there's no right thing to say. There's no magic thing that you're going to say that's going to fix everything for that person. It's just about showing that you are connected to them and that you have empathy. And in the spirit, I guess, of sharing and vulnerability and connection, I will just end on a reflection of how important I think this is. As I kind of alluded to at the start, which is something I never talk about. I'm someone who deals with chronic pain every day, and I never talk about it. And I have built up a very strong, like, narrative around myself of this, like, very functional, confident person that, like, doesn't have any issues and just kind of, like, breezes in through life 15 out of 10. And that's not true. And it impacts, obviously, my health and then also my mental health, because anyone who knows what pain is like knows that it's incredibly fatiguing and wears you down. And the moment that I realised that that kind of needed to change was when I did a charity swim recently, which raised money for Starlight Kids Foundation, and I did it because it was like a reflection on my own childhood and the health issues I had. And I had a friend say to me, oh, I sort of knew that this was an issue for you, but I just never really felt like I could bring it up, because I just didn't really feel like it was something that you ever wanted me or would let me do. And then I had a few friends echo that to me in a row, and it made me realise that in running from shame, and the shame I sort of felt around that, I had isolated myself from the people who were meant to be my support networks and made them not feel like they could even do that and reach out. And then for them to do that was so powerful, because it made me realise that there's no shame in it, and you always need to be able to ask for help. So I would just encourage you have no idea, reaching out and just asking someone that question, the impact that it can have for them. So on that note, I don't have business cards. I say it's because I'm environmentally friendly. It's because I'm lazy. So if you ever want to just, like, ask a question, reach out, do whatever, please feel free to. And I'll keep this up. But does anyone have any reflections they want to share from the activity, things that did work, didn't, questions they want to ask, or just, like, something that they needed to get out about burnout before we wrap up? Yeah. Sure.
There's nowhere for me, no GP I can see that doesn't actually get not taking that anymore. So it's actually it's a tough thing, and I've been running over it for about 2 years now. And I've decided with the support of the GP nurses, Australian professors, that I will see a doctor in Adelaide, which is 700 kilometres away. But it's probably the best thing for me to do. So I can see the GP at work, it's an emergency, but
Yeah.
I need that real doctor.
Yeah.
I just want to share that. I think that was a common thread in our conversation.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, because aside from just the general stress that you can feel with needing to reach out. It could also be an issue of that there isn't anyone appropriate to reach out to, especially if you're rural and remote. That is such an added stress on top of that as well. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure it resonates with a lot of people in the room. There are remote services, I guess I would encourage people to try and access as well. Like I said, nurse and midwife support. Like if you're not sure where to start, I'd start with them because it's a confidential 24/7 phone line staffed by nurses and midwives trained in counselling who also can link you to other services and resources as well and will have heard similar things and can link you in and might know an avenue for you to take. And more as we embrace technology, a lot of mental health professionals, psychologists and psychiatrists are utilising things like Skype to be able to run consults. And it's not the same as being there face-to-face with someone, but it's still a service that you can get and access. So you don't have to travel as much as often, although probably will still be some involved. Questions? Any other questions or reflections or things people want to share? Feedback from how terrible the activity was? Okay, cool. Well, I wore a bright shirt intentionally so that if you did have anything you want to talk about but didn't want to talk about, that you could find me today to do that. So please feel free to come up to me at any point. I'll look nothing like this tonight. That's all I'm saying. It's a surprise.
Maybe you can have a Brittany moment.
Oh, God. Can you imagine? That'd be so... Oh, wow, that'd be full circle. No, more vintage.
Oh, my God.
So... Yeah, thank you very much for coming to what I think is a really important session. As I said, I don't pretend to be an expert. It's just something I care a lot about and I'm passionate about. And I really appreciate everybody showing up physically and mentally and emotionally and for all your attention. So thank you very much. Anyone can come back from burnout.